Good morning. Today's lecture is about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Post-Civil War Reconstruction, properly known as First Reconstruction, ended in 1877 when the presidential election of 1876 ended in a tie, and Democrats and Republicans made a deal. The Republicans got the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, became president of the United States. And Democrats got something they had been looking forward to ever since the end of the Civil War in 1865, and that was the removal of the occupation soldiers from the North. The Union soldiers left the states of the Old South. So the North's occupation of the South was over in 1877. From the end of the Civil War in 1865 to 1877, the victorious Union Army occupied the South in order to make sure Southerners obeyed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. These amendments ended slavery, established civil rights for Black Americans, and even guaranteed them the vote. Were it not for the presence of the Union Army, I am sad to say, white Southerners would have largely ignored these civil rights of its Black American citizens. First Reconstruction, otherwise known as Radical Reconstruction in the South, was a golden age for blacks. Black people of the South during this period of time, it only lasted about a dozen years, could vote, they could hold public office, they could own businesses. They were, as much as a government could make it, free and equal citizens. But when the federal government withdrew its troops from the South in 1877, marking the end of First Reconstruction. So the withdrawal of military force marks the end of First Reconstruction. And then subsequently, there is a reemergence of white supremacy, of white power in these southern states. I'm afraid the treatment of Black Americans was not only disappointing, but was even often unconstitutional. Things got worse. By the end of the 19th century, the South was well on its way to establishing a firm segregation of the races. This policy was known as Jim Crow. So Jim Crow segregation. Unfortunately, Southern progressivism, the reform movement of the early 20th century, Southern progressivism was distinctly racist. It was not countering the racism of the time. Blacks suffered at the hands of progressives in the South in this period. Then, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, one joke was told about how a reporter asked an obviously dirt poor black man how he was doing in the Great Depression. And the old man replied, "Depression? What do you mean depression? This is just regular living for us black folks." In other words, the Depression had little impact on blacks, especially in the South, in the 1930s because their lives were already in a depression. But as we have seen, the New Deal did help blacks economically. The New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, the federal government, helped blacks. So much so that most blacks switched their allegiance from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation. They voted Republican when they could vote at all. Most blacks did up until this time. But they switched parties in the 1936 election when Roosevelt was running for re-election because the New Deal, the Democratic Party, was the party of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. The New Deal was clearly helping most blacks. And to this day, most blacks vote Democratic. And in 1936, that is when this began to be a factor, the factor for blacks in the American political system. So in 1945, American society was divided along racial and ethnic lines. The color of a person's skin usually affected how he or she was treated in terms of job opportunities and civil rights. But changes were coming. And the changes were instigated, brought about largely because of the transformative effect of the Second World War. As in so many other of these post-World War II lectures, we drop back to the Second World War to explain the way the world was or the change that was coming. This is true in the Civil Rights Movement as well. For World War II had a tremendous impact on the way Americans of both colors regarded each other. As a result of the war, blacks had received new experiences, which gave them confidence in what they could do. They had received new training in various kinds of jobs, whether they were mechanics or truck drivers or cooks or what have you. And yes, the American military is segregated during World War II. Few blacks during World War II saw combat, but they were used in these support roles, and in these roles, then they learned these new skills. And then after the war, many blacks were eager to put these new skills to work in the civilian world. Then in 1947, something amazing happened. Jackie Robinson, a black man with an incredible talent for playing baseball, entered the previously all-white major leagues as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers. So he broke the color barrier in 1947 in Major League Baseball. And in breaking the color barrier in a prominent major league sport like baseball, Jackie Robinson then sets the agenda for the rest of the country for blacks to look at as a way that color barriers are going to fall. And so now there's a clear goal of desegregation in America. Blacks fought for equality through the courts as well. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, pursued equality through the legal system because passing legislation in Congress was difficult to do. Congress in this period was controlled by Democrats, and frankly the Republicans weren't all that interested in civil rights legislation either. But it was controlled by Democrats, and the bastion of the Democratic Party at this time is the South. So it's virtually impossible to get civil rights legislation through the legislature, through Congress. It's hopeless until the 1950s, and even then difficult. The great black lawyer and later justice of the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, represented the Brown family of Topeka, Kansas, in their lawsuit against that city, Topeka, Kansas, for their segregated schools. Now, Kansas is not a state of the Deep South. It's not even technically a southern state. And yet, schools in Topeka, segregated. Eventually, in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in its famous Brown versus Board of Education decision, perhaps the most famous decision in the history of the Republic. The Supreme Court decreed that separate schools for blacks and whites, which was the norm in the South, blacks did not attend white schools. And it was also the norm in some border states like Kansas, that these schools were inherently unequal, and because they were inherently unequal, they were therefore unconstitutional. It would be hard to exaggerate the Brown decision's role as a dynamic factor in the development of the modern civil rights movement. A new vision. So after World War II, a new determination arose among black people that resulted in new leaders and created new tactics to gain full civil rights for black Americans. But perhaps the catalyst for all that was to come was a 43-year-old black seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks. After a hard day's work in early December 1955, Mrs. Parks was riding a bus home when a white passenger, following the Jim Crow mores of the time, told her to get up and surrender her seat. In fact, these were not just mores, but these were laws. Parks refused to give up the seat, and she was promptly arrested. The NAACP leaders in Montgomery now seized on Rosa Parks' defiance to make a statement about civil rights. They organized a boycott of Montgomery's bus system. A contest of wills now ensued between the city's white leaders who were trying to run a now money-losing bus system because blacks were avoiding using the buses, so they're not paying their fares and so forth, and blacks made up a large percentage of the riders. Meanwhile, the city's blacks tried to get to work and tried to get to stores and they tried to get to churches without the benefit of this mass transportation system. So this is a hardship. It's a test of wills to see who can last. Blacks now found a new charismatic leader, a young minister by the name of Martin Luther King. And King was a student of Indian nationalist leader Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi espoused, that is, he advocated a theory of nonviolent resistance. Don't just turn the other cheek, but confront, resist, but nonviolently. He developed a strategy then, King, for confronting whites with their racism, without resorting to violence. Now, I'm not suggesting that every one of King's followers lived up to the nonviolent creed. That's not what happened. But at one meeting, King told his black listeners, if we are arrested every day, if we are exploited every day, if we are trampled over every day, don't ever let anyone pull you so low as to hate them. We must use the weapon of love. We must have compassion and understanding for those who hate us. And here is the Christian turning the other cheek. After a year of the bus boycott, in December of 1956, the Supreme Court ordered Montgomery's buses desegregated. This is, of course, the second great victory of the civil rights movement, the first being the Brown decision. Dwight Eisenhower, Little Rock, and the beginning of Second Reconstruction. It is not human nature to wake up the next morning and read in the newspapers that, well, the Supreme Court has made its decision, and so all the nation's school leaders in the school districts said, well, we have to desegregate our schools starting tomorrow. That is not the way human beings are. So few southern cities quickly desegregated their schools. In 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, this is several years after the Brown decision, some black families sought to gain admission for their children to Little Rock's Central High School. The city of Little Rock opposed them, but the courts, their directions already from the Supreme Court, sided with the students. Now the governor of Arkansas, a man by the name of Orval Faubus, called out the National Guard to make sure that 9 black students did not enter the high school. Now the president, Dwight Eisenhower, grew impatient with the governor after weeks of negotiations on the telephone, revealed that the governor could not be trusted to keep his word to protect the black students. So he was telling Eisenhower one thing and he was doing something else on the ground. Eisenhower now ordered Army Chief of Staff General Maxwell Taylor who had served under Eisenhower during World War II, to send elements of the famed 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to restore order and ensure the eventual integration of the schools. Now, some of you know that this is an airborne division. What that means, these guys did not parachute into Little Rock. They were trucked into Little Rock. But nevertheless, there they are. And Eisenhower at this time particularly ordered Taylor to send enough force so that there would be no doubt as to who was in charge in Little Rock. And once the federal troops were in place, in force, there was no more violence. Now many American presidents or governors would be tempted to put their finger in the wind, so to speak, and to gauge public opinion. How many troops can I send? Okay, I'll send a couple of dozen, which would only inflame the situation because it wouldn't be enough to guarantee peace. Eisenhower is not interested in any of that nonsense. Send enough force so there's no doubt as to who is in charge. Nevertheless, the people of Little Rock blocked the integration of their high school for 2 years. 2 years. But Eisenhower's decision to send American troops to the South demonstrated the federal government's willingness to use military force to establish black civil rights in a way it had not done since the end of First Reconstruction 80 years before. Thus, Eisenhower's decision, again, to use military force in the South marks the beginning of Second Reconstruction. Malcolm X. By the early 1960s, there were other black civil rights leaders who were making headlines. But they did not agree with Martin Luther King and his philosophy of nonviolent protest and confrontation. They disagreed over strategy. One of these leaders was a man by the name of Malcolm X. X, who called himself X because he did not want to use the last name of some former slave master. Again, most slave families were given last names by their owners. He did not want to use that name. And X reminded everybody who saw it that white Americans had taken away not only the freedom, but the very identity of blacks who were enslaved. And so Malcolm X was one of the leaders of the militant black group known as the Black Muslims. And these guys were about violence. They were diametrically opposed to King and his nonviolent approach. And so they advocated the use of violence to bring social change. Now, filmmaker Spike Lee has argued that shortly before Malcolm X's death in 1965, that X had begun to move away from advocating violence. That may well be the case. But I would like to take this opportunity to tell you that, in my personal opinion, Americans were blessed by God to have the nonviolent king as the primary leader of the civil rights movement in America. And even then, we should note that this movement was not without its violence. Literally hundreds of people would die in the mid-60s over the race issue. 1963, year of confrontation. By the summer of 1963, the civil rights movement had reached a flood tide. It had momentum. Protests and demonstrations took place, often accompanied by white retaliation in the form of beatings and bombings in the South. Indeed, incidents flickered across the South like lightning. In April 1963, Martin Luther King led a giant demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, perhaps the most racist city in the country, and the reason why King chose it. And so there is a King-led protest to march against the segregated businesses and institutions of Birmingham. Now, most Americans have a television by this time. And millions of Americans watched on television as the symbol of Birmingham's racism, its police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, turned on the black demonstrators with clubs, fire hoses, and police dogs. These pictures on the evening news, in Americans' homes, on their television sets, helped Americans see the brutality of Southern racism in a way if they had never been to the South before, they could not have known. So Martin Luther King, with those television pictures, was beginning to win the war for public opinion. In the same year, 1963, King and other civil rights leaders decided to bring pressure directly to bear on Congress, on the Kennedy administration. John Kennedy was president by this time. And so they organized a March on Washington. What did they hope to accomplish in the March on Washington? Number one, to raise America's consciousness concerning racism. Here is a major march on the nation's capital, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating, many of them white, although clearly the majority black. So the whole idea is simply to raise the consciousness of Americans about the problem of racism. Number two, energize black people to advance their own cause. Don't imagine that every single black person was a civil rights activist. It is not so. Don't dehumanize blacks this way by lumping them all into one category. And so the March on Washington is designed to get more black people to take part. Some are afraid. Some are afraid of where they live. If they were to take part in such a march, they would be, at the very least, ostracized, and perhaps some kind of retribution would take place. Others with a relatively comfortable life are afraid to jeopardize that relatively comfortable life. Blacks, just like whites, have their own agenda. Each person is an individual. And finally, number three, pressure Congress to pass more civil rights legislation. That's the ultimate goal. So if you're thinking, well, what about the amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments? You're right, good question. How come we just don't enforce it? Well, the Supreme Court had emasculated the 14th and 15th Amendments over the years, especially in the late 19th century. But clearly the United States was not living up to the spirit of those three amendments. Well, over 300,000 marchers showed up on August 28, 1963 to accomplish the foregoing. And they wanted to hear America's great civil rights leaders of the day, including, but not limited to, Martin Luther King. And King got up and addressed the crowd, again, well over 250,000, estimates vary. And he regaled the crowd with his speech, and then he was about to sit down when a singer by the name of Mahalia Jackson shouted out to him. She said to Martin, "Tell him about your dream." And so now King returns to the microphone. And this was not planned. This was a speech that he had given in other times and places, but he hadn't planned to give it today. And so he said, "I have a dream." It was a dream about an America that someday in the future did not regard race at all. Well, that America is a long ways away. Just 2 weeks after the March on Washington, a bomb exploded in a Birmingham church on a Sunday morning. And this bomb killed 4 little black girls as they attended Sunday school. There were riots and demonstrations afterward in which 2 more people died. And by the way, many historians regard King's speech at the March on Washington as the greatest speech of the 20th century. It is certainly in the top 3 or 4. But one must remember, of course, Franklin Roosevelt's speech declaring war on Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And one could also include Franklin Roosevelt's speech regarding fear. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself in the midst of the Great Depression. And Woodrow Wilson's speech, by the way, in his declaration of war, seeking of the declaration of war against Germany in 1917, would also be certainly in this category. But I don't mean to denigrate King's speech by mentioning these other speeches, not at all, but to raise it up and to put it alongside these incredibly important speeches. John Kennedy's assassination. 2.5 months after the March on Washington, on a sunny November day, November 22nd, there is a good example of a test question that will never appear on one of my tests. In Dallas, Texas, John Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The nation was stunned. In 1963, I was sitting in my third grade class. And by the way, thank you, Mrs. Webb. When she told us, I believe it was after lunch, of what had happened. If I remember correctly, the school was canceled for the rest of the day, and we all went home. John Kennedy was only in Dallas, Texas, because he believed that he was losing the support of Southern Democrats who were very much opposed to his civil rights agenda. So to Dallas he went. Presidential election is coming up in the next year. But Kennedy is assassinated. The primary result of JFK's assassination for the civil rights movement, which of course is the topic today, was that it seemed to many Americans that it was time to honor JFK's memory with the passage of some kind of civil rights legislation, meaningful civil rights legislation. Moreover, the new president, Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was determined, perhaps even more than Kennedy was, to achieve such a piece of civil rights history. And so in 1964, after much cajoling from Lyndon Johnson, Congress passed and Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This Civil Rights Act banned discrimination, Jim Crow, segregation in public places and by employers. Any one of you who's ever filled out an application has seen an aspect of the 1964 Civil Rights Act on that application. Discrimination is not tolerated. It's illegal. Just as an aside, just so you understand that we are interested in human nature when we talk about history, so after this Civil Rights Act of 64 was passed, every single employer from that date on was sure not to discriminate, right? No. We passed a law. We didn't change people's hearts. So it's going to take time for that law to really have an impact. In 1965, Congress passed a Voting Rights Act that made literacy tests for voting illegal. In some states, you had to pass a literacy test, a reading test, in order to be able to vote. And whites had to take the test, but usually the tests were different. A black had to take a very difficult reading test in some places. White's a really easy one. Discrimination. So the Voting Rights Act. Assassination. In 1967, Martin Luther King was increasingly concerned over the war in Vietnam, which for Americans had begun in earnest in 1965. And he was increasingly concerned over poverty in America. And so in early 1968, he made several trips to Memphis, Tennessee, to organize a poor people's march in that city. Not a civil rights march, but a poor people's march. On the evening of April 4th, King stepped out of his second-story motel room onto the balcony. His friends inside the room heard what they thought was a backfire down in the street somewhere. It wasn't. It was a rifle shot from a high-powered rifle. The bullet struck King in the jaw and knocked him to the floor of the balcony. And a few heartbeats later, Martin Luther King was dead. Epilogue. Since Martin Luther King's death, America has come a long way. But we still have a long way to go to realize the ideal of freedom and equality for all of our citizens. While it is true that our laws forbid discrimination based on race, in the hearts of many of our people, racism still lives. Vastly more back in the 1960s than today, but yet there is still racism in America. It may be true that the battle against racism can only be won in each person's heart. Martin Luther King believed this, and that is one of the reasons that he always preached nonviolence. For King, the philosophy of nonviolence was an effort to make his enemy his friend. Again, this is in the tradition of Christianity. For King knew that passing laws, absolutely necessary, would not change the world. That could only be accomplished by changing human hearts. Well, I thank you very much, and God bless you all.